Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome once again to Money Sense. Your hosts this morning are Christoph Barnett and myself, Simon Caudry. 3 weeks ago, the UK went to the polls and voted in a referendum where the question asked was, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave? On a turnout of 71.8%, the electorate voted 52% to leave and 48% to remain. Since then, it's fair to say there have been quite a few seismic changes in the political landscape within the UK. To cut through the noise and assess the actual detail, we're delighted to be joined in the first part of today's show by telephone from the UK by Mr. Carl Emerson, who is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Good morning, Carl, and thank you for joining us.
No problem at all, Simon.
Carl, you're someone who works at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is probably an organisation that over here in the Cayman Islands is unfamiliar to a lot of people. Perhaps you could just explain what the IFS is, how it's funded, and what the purpose of the organisation is, please.
So we're an educational charity, a not-for-profit organisation, whose aim is to do economic research, scientifically rigorous research, which we publish in peer-reviewed academic journals, but we're trying to do research which is important for policy making and is having an influence on policy making. So as well as disseminating our research through those journals, we also do reports, press releases, briefings aimed at civil servants, journalists, policymakers, in order to try and make sure that the lessons of our research are directly impacting on policy and trying to lead to better policy making happening, mainly in the UK, but on occasion elsewhere. Our funding is, our most important funder is the Economic and Social Research Council. That's money that the UK taxpayer provides via an arm's length body, so that body pays for all social science research in the UK. They're our most important funder. We also get some funding from the European Research Council, the European equivalent, plus some charitable trusts in the UK, plus some money from organisations like the World Bank. We don't get very much from the private sector, and we certainly don't do any private consultancy.
So is it fair to say then that the IFS is an independent, non-political organisation? In other words, are any of your research papers biased one way or the other, or are you always trying to get just an impartial view of where the economics are of an argument?
It's an impartial view. We're trying very hard to make sure that our research is independent and is seen to be independent. Both of those things are very important. And often we're just pointing out the trade-offs of a situation. So if the government wants to achieve a particular objective, we might say, well, the government wants to do that objective, this is the way they're going about doing it, and these are the trade-offs they're making, and perhaps this is an alternative way of meeting that same objective. We won't, for example, take a stance on how big the state should be, but we will take a stance on how, for a given size of the state, you might try and collect tax revenue as efficiently as you possibly can.
Okay, so with all that being said, the topic of this morning's show is Brexit and the implications for the United Kingdom, the European Union, the world, and including the Cayman Islands. Is it fair to say that most economists, during the discussion leading up to the Brexit referendum, said that the vote to leave would likely lower the UK's GDP growth rate? And if so, why would they have said that? What was the argument that they were principally making?
I think it was not just the majority, it was the absolute vast majority, as overwhelming a consensus as you think you'll ever see amongst economists. So not all of them, but the vast majority felt that the UK GDP would be higher if we stay in the EU than if we leave. And I think there's three reasons why you will think that GDP will be lower than it would otherwise be outside. The first is uncertainty. We now don't know exactly what the UK's relationship with the EU is going to look like over the next few years. We can see already there's a lot of uncertainty in many markets, and we know that when there's a lot of uncertainty around, companies hold off making investment decisions, households hold off making their spending decisions, and all of that in the short run will have a negative impact on GDP. So GDP will be lower than what it would have been. And as I say, there's already evidence that uncertainty has increased. The second is trade. We know that whatever happens, our access to the single market will not be, the European single market will not be as great as what it is at the moment. Maybe we'll end up with a world where there are no tariffs on exports of our goods to the EU, but even if that's the case, there'll be customs checks, which can also be a restraint on trade. We may not get as much access to the single market in services as we currently get. Now, trade is widely recognized by economists as being very important for living standards, and the reason is if you trade with lots of countries, that allows you to operate in bigger markets. Bigger markets allows more specialization. It allows the UK to do the things that it's really good at and other countries to do the things that they're really good at. If you don't trade as much, you can't specialize as much, and that's why that's harmful to your economic performance. And then the third reason is foreign direct investment. The UK gets a large share of its foreign investment in the UK comes from other European countries. It also gets some investment in the UK from other countries around the world that want to invest into the EU. Now, we know that that foreign investment is important because there's evidence that shows that in the UK, it's those companies that are owned by foreign investment that are more productive. They are on average the most productive operations in the UK, and we think that's important not just for the fact that they're more productive, but other firms around them might learn from their activities and raise their game too. So there's three reasons. It's increased uncertainty, less trade, and less foreign direct investment, and all of those point to GDP being lower than what it otherwise would be.
Okay, so I want to address each one of those in turn, but also in the context of the wider conversation. When you look at the UK today, then, as a result of the referendum, what industries would one expect to be most affected by the three elements that you talk about?
The deepest effects immediate would be those industries where firms were thinking about doing an investment now. So you wouldn't necessarily get firms disinvesting straight away, but you might get firms who were going to make an investment, perhaps not straight away deciding to make that investment somewhere else in Europe, like Frankfurt or Dublin, or perhaps somewhere else in the world, but maybe they'll just hold off for a bit. So it might be industries where there was some investment coming, maybe that investment will be put on hold for a bit. Obviously, the trade argument suggests there's going to be industries that are reliant on exporting in the long run who'll be worse off. But interestingly, in the short run, they won't necessarily be worse off because of the depreciation in sterling relative to the euro. So at the moment, firms that sell a lot of their goods to elsewhere in Europe, while in the long run they may be very concerned about their ability to trade on the same basis as they do now, in the short run, well, we're still a member of the EU at the moment, we still have that access to the single market, and the pound has depreciated, meaning that those goods can be sold at a lower price in euros while reaping in the same number of pounds. So there's a kind of interesting trade-off in the short run and the long run for those exporting industries.
Is there an argument to be made, so taking the flip side of the debate, is there an argument to be made that the current lower level of the pound against the dollar, against the euro and against other currencies, if that were to continue, the fact that there may be trade barriers in the future or tariffs in the future, they actually just simply net off against the depreciation, and so in essence, nothing much has changed?
I don't think that's the case. I think that the reason the pound has devalued is because in the long run we think the UK is going to be poorer. It's not the case we think the pound was artificially high before the referendum result, as you might have believed in the early 90s when the UK left the exchange rate mechanism and the depreciation in the pound was then a spur to growth. This depreciation is because we expect to be poorer relative to other countries, relative to what we would have been. So the fact that the pound is lower is one way of describing how much poorer the UK now is.
Okay. One of the things that hits hard, perhaps hits the hardest for the average person in the UK when they're looking at the impact of this is the effect on employment. GDP is something that's very difficult to measure and very difficult to translate into what it means for your own living standards. Are we expecting, therefore, as a result of this referendum decision, that employment levels in aggregate will be lower because of the decision made than if the decision had been different?
I think if the increases in uncertainty is such that the UK growth rate really does slow quite sharply, then you'll expect employment to be lower than it would have been, and possibly a rise in unemployment too. I mean, for example, the UK could enter a recession, and that may happen. It's worth noting, however, that over the last few years, the UK economy has been very good at creating jobs. The last recession didn't see the growth in the unemployment rate that many predicted. So it may be that the UK labour market is one that adjusts pretty quickly, and employment might not be the obvious margin of what we see in adjustment. It might be more about wages. Certainly the story of the last few years has been more people in work than what you may well have expected, given how fast the UK economy was growing, or not growing as often was the case, but much lower wage growth, or no wage growth at all. So the recent years have seen, this, in some sense, what you could see as a socially good thing, in that the pain of slow growth has been shared out across a large number of employees earning a bit less, rather than a few employees experiencing the pain of unemployment. So it's possible we'll see a drop in employment, a rise in unemployment, but it's also possible that what we'll see is slower wage growth, and it'll be all employees perhaps who are sharing in the pain.
Okay.
And the other obvious adjustment in the near term, of course, is that the depreciation means that the prices of imported goods will rise, the price of, for example, food imported from other European countries will rise, which means that even if people are earning the same amount in pounds, those pounds won't stretch as far when they're going and doing their shopping.
So what you're saying then is that the average consumer may, as a result of this, see slower wage growth. They may see slightly higher prices, and they're therefore going to consider themselves, or when they go to the shops and they come home from the shops, they're going to say, that cost me more, and I've taken home less income from my employment, therefore I'm worse off, when I do my household budget. Yes,
indeed, and perhaps the other adjustment we may see more over the longer term is that lower wage growth, lower productivity growth in the UK also affects the government's finances. The government here in the UK is running a sizable budget deficit still. It's considerably lower than it was a few years ago, but it's still pretty large, and it wants to eliminate that. Now, to do that will probably require further tax rises and spending cuts, which again may well bear down on the living standards and welfare of different households. So it may not just be a case of seeing higher prices in the shops and less wage growth than they would otherwise have enjoyed. At some point, they may also see that, for example, some taxes could end up going up too.
Got you. Now, I want to turn the conversation ever so slightly to look at some of the claims that were made leading up to the referendum and just really try and understand the implications of them. So there were a couple of claims which I think are related, one being that the UK will have £10 billion more to spend on public services in ways it wants to. And there was also talk of the UK having £350 million per week to spend as it wished, which I guess are two sides of the same coin. What would you make of that? Because that comes back to uncertainty and spending levels and GDP. What should one make of those two claims now that we've actually had this decision?
So the most common claim was the £350 million per week that the UK sends to the EU, and the suggestion that we could, for example, spend that on the NHS. Now, the problem with that argument is that that was the gross contribution that the UK made to the EU budget. So firstly, it ignored what's known as the rebate that the UK gets on its bill. It basically gets a discount that was negotiated many years ago by Margaret Thatcher. So to believe that we'd end up with £350 million is to believe that we wouldn't send any money to Europe, but they would continue to pay us a rebate, which I think is an implausible scenario. And the second problem with the argument was that it ignored the fact that the EU did do some spending in the UK. So while it's true that the UK is a net contributor to the EU budget, as you'd probably expect given that the UK is a richer than average country in the EU, it did receive some spending for agriculture, for regional policy and for science. So rather than £350 per week, I think a better number, once you take into account the rebate, once you take into account the spending in the UK that the EU did, that we may well want to continue with, you're then down to £150 million a week. So the saving in terms of what we send to Brussels is £150 million a week. We also now get control over the agriculture spend, the regional policy spend, and perhaps the science spend, so there's some extra freedoms there. But the bigger picture here is that whatever the truth is in terms of the money we send to Brussels and how much we save there, these effects are completely swamped by what happens in the economy.
Yeah.
The economy would only have to be a little bit smaller as a result of the UK leaving the EU for the effect on tax revenues and public spending to completely dominate any direct savings in the money we send to the EU. So if the UK economy is just 0.6% smaller than it would have been as a result of the UK leaving the EU, that will fully offset the £150 million a week saving that we think we would make. And most economists are suggesting that the harm done to the UK economy is much bigger than that. So we'll be in a world where we'll be talking about, do we want to borrow more, do we want higher taxes, or do we want lower public spending? There is no giveaway as a result of this decision.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense, and thanks for explaining that. we've got about a minute left in the interview, and I just want to ask you about the free trade element, because that's been something that's been discussed ad nauseum almost. And so the argument is that we can negotiate free trade agreements to give us exactly the same access to the European market, or to give the UK exactly the same access to the European market as it currently has. What should one make of that argument, and is that a plausible argument?
So if the UK joins the European Economic Area, that's a grouping of countries that includes Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland. They're the countries that have the best access to the single market outside of the EU. Now, they do enjoy tariff-free exports, so there are no tariffs on their sale of goods to the EU. But there are customs checks, and that's a cost, that is a restraint on trade that exists that the UK would not face at the moment. And there's a literature which shows that those kind of customs checks are an important barrier to trade. So that's trading goods. On services, by being in the EEA, you would get those economies do get access to much of the single market in services, which would be particularly important for the UK because the UK is relatively financial service heavy.
The City of London argument.
And it does, exactly, and it does export a lot of services to the rest of the EU. The difficulty is that the countries in the EEA, such as Norway, in return for that access to the single market, they still make a financial contribution to the EU budget, about half the size of the one that UK made. So you certainly wouldn't be talking about £350 million a week savings then. And probably more importantly, they also accept free movement of people. And that's one of the things that those campaigning for the UK to leave the EU were very heavy on, was the fact that the UK should gain control of its immigration policy. Norway both makes a financial contribution to the EU, and it also accepts free movement of labour. So
if I'm apologies for trying to summarise what you're saying there in a smaller number of words, but just want to make sure it's clear to the audience. What you're saying, I think, is that if we leave the EU and try to obtain, or we are leaving the EU, but if the UK tries to obtain exactly the same terms of trade with respect to services and goods, it will have to either pay money into the EU, or it will have to accept something that those people who are campaigning to leave, immigration, were reluctant to accept in the first place.
Well, in the Norway case, it would be both of those things, both financial contribution and free movement of people. To get access to the single market on anything like what we currently have at the moment, without making a financial contribution, without accepting free movement of people, that's unprecedented.
Right, so we have to, the UK would have to hope, presumably, that one of the two ladies campaigning for Prime Minister, or I should say the leader of the Conservative Party and then Prime Minister, would be able to negotiate quite fiercely to obtain something that has never been achieved before in the history of the European Union, is what I'm hearing from you.
That's correct, and clearly the issue there is whether the EU would want to do that, and whether it would worry that it might send a signal to other countries who might suddenly say, well, actually, we'd quite like that deal too, which is something they'd undoubtedly want to avoid.
Fair enough. Look, Carl, thank you very much for joining us today, and really appreciate you giving us some in-depth analysis of the economics and the arguments that are going to be taking place between the UK, the EU, and just the implications for the UK economy, and what that means for, and what the implications therefore for perhaps other investors around the world. So thank you again for joining us this morning.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Bye-bye then. We're going to take a short break now, and then straight after assess, in the light of Carl's comments, what this might mean specifically for the Cayman Islands. Join us again in 2 minutes. Welcome back. In the final, rather shorter section of today's show, we're going to assess what Brexit means for the Cayman Islands. Let me start this conversation with a personal observation. The majority of economists, as we have heard, have said that Brexit will be bad economically for the UK and for Europe. There are many ways during the negotiations that are coming to mitigate these negatives, but all involve some sort of abandonment of one or more of the key reasons for Brexit. If we look at the market's reaction, the first couple of days were sheer and unadulterated panic. Sterling fell dramatically, equity markets fell substantially, and safe haven assets rose in value. Yet in the weeks since then, the opposite has happened. Markets have risen, in many cases beyond their levels prior to the referendum result. The point I want to make about this is that for any investor listening to today's show who thinks the whole Brexit problem is behind us, I would strongly and unabashedly encourage you to think again. It is almost inconceivable that there won't be a number of unpleasant developments in the weeks and months ahead, and anyone who does invest in equity assets or other assets, ignoring this fact, could well be in for an extremely unpleasant shock. That's perhaps enough for me editorializing at the moment. Christoph, perhaps I could just ask you for your perspective on what you make of the market's reaction. And obviously, in the interview, I made a slight mistake. I said that the two ladies campaigning. Obviously, we have had actually an appointment of Theresa May as the Prime Minister, and she's obviously appointed her Foreign Secretary, her Defence Secretary, her Home Secretary. But what do you make of the market's reaction to the latest developments? It's almost as though Brexit isn't happening. It's almost as though things are absolutely fine, the ship's sailing on.
Well, market prices would certainly tend to indicate that. I mean, in the U.S. markets, we've regained all-time highs from the highs set in May of last year, so over a year ago. Just following on some of the comments I made in the last show about central bank policy and explaining why we have low interest rates in today's world, the stimulus or additional liquidity, where the central banks will buy bonds, use their funds to buy bonds and essentially lower interest rates for everyone, has driven up prices. And it's the perverse incentive is that the market participants have sort of been trained that bad news is in fact good news because it will lead to further stimulus. And so there's definitely uncertainty with Brexit, but then everyone says, well, won't this lead to additional liquidity? And then that will drive people into riskier assets, including stock markets. And so I think that's why the price has gone up. Not necessarily because everything is rosy, but because it will lead to further stimulus.
So what if I'm understanding you correctly, and please feel free to correct me, is that after Brexit, the market's reaction was, what the heck have they done? And therefore there was the panic. And then in the cold light of day, people sort of sat around and discussed and said, well, because of this chaotic outcome, central banks will be forced to do things which probably in ordinary times they wouldn't want to. But those things mean that equity prices will have to go up because there'll be more money chasing equities, whether that's reasonable and rational or not. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. I mean, there was a bit of overreaction, to be sure, because if you have a 10% drop the day after, what does that mean? Does that mean that the trade with the UK is going to drop 10%? I mean, that doesn't seem reasonable, even in some of the most pessimistic forecasts of the result of Brexit. So, I think part of it was, okay, let's actually reassess what's going on. So it wasn't just the stimulus, but, okay, let's have calmer heads. And there are always investors waiting for those declines. I mean, that's part of investing, right? You wait for a drop and say, okay, well, this is what I was waiting for. Now I want to invest.
So, but absent the prospect of whether it be the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, or the Federal Reserve making these policies of what is called quantitative easing, absent those policies, would we have equity levels remotely close to where they are currently?
I mean, it's a hard question, right? Because we have one history that we can look back on, and it's a fallacy to look back and say, well, we've had this one path, it had to be so. And so it's hard to give what's called the counterfactual, say, well, if we didn't have this, it would still be high. I mean, in the end, equity markets and stock prices are a function of the earnings of the companies. And so we're saying that if they hadn't lowered interest rates to zero, would the companies not be making money? I think they would be. Now, certainly in the bond markets, the interest rates wouldn't quite be so low, so perhaps we wouldn't have reach the levels of prices of bonds that we have. But then on the other side, instead of 2% interest, you'd be making 4%. So is your return, you're sort of front loading your return by lowering interest rates in the present at the expense of future gains. So I mean, personally, wouldn't we rather 5% for the long term than have a capital gain on our bond now, but going forward only 0.5% yield on our bond. So it's sort of we have to be careful about borrowing from the future, borrowing returns from the future. So there's an argument to say it wouldn't be as high, but I mean I think companies are profitable in general, so stock prices will increase over time.
Sure. Well, let's turn the conversation in the few remaining minutes of the show just to assess what it might mean now that we have the potential new policies coming out of the UK as a result of the cabinet being appointed, what it might mean for a Caymanian who perhaps has a British passport. If Brexit happens, and the working assumption is still that Brexit will happen because the new Prime Minister has said Brexit means Brexit, what will that mean for the rights of a Caymanian to work and travel freely throughout Europe?
Well, I guess the immediate concern is for those of us Caymanians who have applied for British citizenship and have a British passport who who appreciate the ease of travel that it comes with. I mean, I remember we'd go with the Cayman passport and it says British on it, but then you'd go to the border and, they're looking through their book to see how Cayman is treated. So it's certainly a whole lot easier with the British passport. Now, we kind of have to think back, well, before the EU, was the UK passport valid? Or valued? Absolutely, right? It's a sort of a hierarchy of countries that have, I guess we'd call it visa-free travel, and the UK is consistently near the top of that list. And so there's a list of countries you don't have to have visa. So that I'm not necessarily concerned about. I doubt strongly that the policy towards Cayman in terms of the citizenship will be affected by by Brexit, change in Brexit policies. So the visas will be, I don't think that'll be travel necessarily. Now, the working and moving, I'm actually not sure to what extent Caymanians have taken that opportunity to move to the continent of Europe and try to establish themselves there. But that may be affected if the freedom of movement is curtailed.
Which, of course, as you say, if not many people have taken that up, that's not so much of a problem. But to the extent people may in the future, in 4 or 5 years, say, hey, I've graduated, I want to spend a little time working in France, Italy or Germany or Spain, perhaps that might be impacted negatively depending on the state of the negotiations. I guess we are still in uncertain times in uncharted territory. We don't know where those negotiations are going to be. They're going to be led by some more colourful characters in the UK, which I guess will keep the headline writers happy, if nothing else, right? The political landscape is ever changing.
I mean, I think perspective is necessary. I mean, looking back at European history, this is, a non-binding referendum is certainly preferable to how they used to solve their disputes. And so the people have always thought things are getting worse, and historically, we've as humanity we've made progress over time. So perspective and optimism, I think, there's hope, I guess.
Well, I think Christoph, your last words there were "there's hope," which is, if not the best, one of the very better ways of ending a conversation on a topic of creates a lot of anger and polarizing opinions. So thank you, Christoph, again for joining us. As a final note, though, before we do leave today's show, I wish to once again thank you all for listening and remind you that today's show can be heard as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage anyone who has a question or topic that they wish us to cover or consider to email us at moneysense@candw.ky. And we all have also entered the realms of Twitter here on Money Sense, and we have our own Twitter handle, which is Money Sense Radio. Be sure to follow us and post any questions or comments there if you'd like, and we will reply. With that, thank you once again, goodbye, and we'll join you again in 2 weeks' time.
Money Sense is brought to you with the support of OneTradeX. OneTradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.